They were intimate. 30 minutes into it, they couldn't separate. At first, they laughed. Then they panicked. They tried everything. Nothing worked. An hour later, they called 911. The dispatcher thought it was a prank. It wasn't. When the paramedics arrived, they found two healthy 26-year-olds stuck together inside a downtown apartment. Neighbors watched. Phones came out. The embarrassment was over the roof. Still, it wasn't done. They covered them with blankets before rushing them to the emergency room. Neither of them had any idea what the doctors were about to find. This is Hidden Pathogens.
This is Hidden Pathogens?
3 weeks earlier, they weren't dating, they weren't in love, they weren't even trying to be. 26-year-old Nicholas Carmichael had just started working at a marketing agency in Dallas. Quiet, funny, the kind of guy who got along with everyone but kept his private life exactly that, private. 24-year-old Ava Mitchell worked 2 floors above him in the same building. Different department, same lunch break. They met over a broken coffee machine. It started with small talk, then lunch, then drinks after work. Neither wanted a relationship. Both had just gotten out of one. So they made a deal. No labels, no expectations, no drama. Just 2 friends who enjoyed each other's company. It worked. At least, that's what they told themselves. They never held hands in public, never posted pictures together. If coworkers asked, they were just friends. That was important. Because if anyone found out what was really happening between them, both of them would have a lot of uncomfortable questions to answer. For almost a month, everything went exactly as planned. Dinner after work, a movie once or twice, the occasional night together. Then they went home. No arguments, no jealousy, no promises. It was simple. Until one Thursday night, Ava sent Nicholas a text. "You coming over?" He replied 2 minutes later. "Be there in 15. Neither of them knew that before midnight, they would be making the most embarrassing emergency call of their lives. Nicholas arrived just after 8. Ava lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that looked like every other apartment complex in Dallas. Gray walls, white trim, a parking lot already half full by sunset. They ordered pizza, watched half a movie, and spent the next hour teasing each other about work. Nothing about the night felt unusual. No alcohol, no drugs, no new medications. Just 2 healthy adults doing what they had done several times before. By 10:37 p.m., the movie had long since become background noise. Ava laughed at something Nicholas said. He leaned closer. One thing led to another. They made out as usual. For the first 20 minutes, everything was completely normal. Then Nicholas suddenly stopped. Wait. Ava looked up. What? He tried to pull out. Nothing happened. He frowned and tried again. Harder this time. Still nothing. Ava felt it too. Not pain, pressure. Like every muscle in her pelvis had tightened at once. They both went still. "Are you joking?" she asked. "I wish I was." At first they laughed. It seemed impossible. They waited a minute, then another. Nicholas tried again. Nothing. The laughter disappeared. Ava reached for the bedside clock. 10:51 p.m. 14 minutes had passed. "Okay," she said quietly. "This is getting weird." They tried changing positions. They tried relaxing. They tried not panicking. Nothing worked. At 11:07 p.m., Ava picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen. "If I call 911. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Both of them understood exactly what it would mean. The secret they had spent a month hiding from coworkers, friends, and family was about to become a medical emergency, and they still had no idea why they were stuck. When they finally got the courage to call 911, the dispatcher picked. She didn't laugh. She had heard stranger calls, but not many. "Stay where you are," she said calmly. "Help is on the way." The next 12 minutes felt like an hour. Neither of them said much. The embarrassment had faded. Something else had taken its place. Fear. A knock echoed through the apartment. Then another. Dallas Fire Rescue. Nicholas closed his eyes. This is really happening. The paramedics asked only a few questions before covering them with blankets to protect their privacy. No jokes, no comments, just quiet professionalism. Within minutes, they were on their way to the emergency department. The ride was silent. Ava stared at the ceiling of the ambulance. Nicholas couldn't stop watching the clock. It had now been more than an hour. At the hospital, they were taken through a private entrance away from the crowded waiting room. The emergency physician listened carefully as they explained what had happened. Neither had any significant medical history. Neither had taken any drugs or new medications. Neither remembered feeling any pain before everything suddenly changed. The doctor nodded. He had seen severe pelvic muscle spasms before. Rare, embarrassing, usually temporary. He asked everyone except the essential staff to step outside. The curtain closed. The room became quiet. Several minutes passed, then 10. When the curtain finally opened again, the physician's expression wasn't one of surprise. It was concern. He ordered blood tests. Then additional imaging. A nurse looked at the chart. "Doctor," he was already reading it. Something didn't fit. This wasn't behaving the way it should, and whatever was happening, it wasn't over. Something else is wrong. The emergency physician glanced at the clock. It had been almost 2 hours. This should have resolved by now. He asked the nurse to prepare medication to help relax the pelvic muscles. Nicholas tried not to move. Every attempt only made things worse. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Ava didn't answer. She was staring at the ceiling. The nurse noticed it first. "Ma'am," no response. "Ava?" She blinked slowly. "My head." The doctor turned toward her. "What about it?" "It hurts." "Where?" She pointed behind her right eye. He nodded. "On a scale from 1 to 10? She thought for a second. 8. He wasn't overly concerned. The stress alone could explain a headache. Her blood pressure had been climbing since the ambulance arrived. Her heart rate was still elevated. Everything fit. Or at least, most of it did. Then Ava winced. Not because of the situation, because the lights above her suddenly felt unbearable. "Can you turn those off?" The room fell quiet. The doctor looked at the nurse. "Has she complained about light before?" The nurse shook her head. "No." The doctor frowned. "A headache, light sensitivity, rapidly increasing blood pressure. Those weren't the symptoms he expected to see tonight." He looked back at Nicholas. For the first time, he stopped thinking about how to separate them and started wondering if that was the least of their problems. The emergency physician looked around the room. "Everyone except the nurse, stay outside." The curtain closed. The room became quiet. Ava's breathing had become fast and shallow. "Try to slow your breathing," the doctor said. I'm trying." The nurse checked her blood pressure again. Higher. Nicholas noticed. "Is she okay? We're going to take care of both of you." The physician administered medication intended to help relax the involuntary muscle spasm. Then, they waited. Nobody rushed. Nobody forced anything. Minutes passed. The tension in the room slowly eased. The physician nodded to the nurse. "It looks like it's resolving." A few moments later, it was over. Neither Nicholas nor Ava spoke. The silence was almost worse than the panic. The doctor pulled a stool closer. "What happened tonight is rare," he said calmly. "The important thing is that you're both safe." He expected relief. Instead, Ava leaned forward and grabbed the edge of the bed. "My head," the words were barely audible. "It feels worse." The physician looked up. "Worse than before?" She nodded. She squeezed her eyes shut. "I think I'm going to be sick." The nurse handed her an emesis bag, just as she vomited. The room fell silent. Stress could explain a headache, even vomiting, but something about this didn't fit. The physician performed another neurological examination. "Can you follow my finger?" She did. "Squeeze my hands. Equal strength. Smile for me. Normal." Everything looked reassuring. Yet the headache kept getting worse. He turned to the nurse. "Let's get a non-contrast CT of her head." The nurse paused. "For the headache?" "Yes." He looked back at Ava. "I don't think tonight is over." Neither did she. What none of them knew was that the reason she'd come to the hospital was no longer the reason she was staying. The CT scanner hummed to a stop. Ava lay perfectly still. Every bump in the hallway had made the pain worse. She had stopped talking. Not because she couldn't, because speaking made her head pound. The technician pushed her back toward the emergency department. Nicholas was already waiting, still wearing a hospital gown, still trying to understand how an embarrassing night had turned into this. The emergency physician stood at the computer as the first images appeared. He scrolled once, then again. His expression changed. The bright smile he'd forced all night disappeared. He enlarged one image, then another. The nurse stepped closer. "What is it?" The physician didn't answer immediately. There shouldn't be blood there. He picked up the phone. "I need radiology to review this now." Within minutes, the on-call radiologist was looking at the scan. A thin, bright layer surrounded part of Ava's brain. Not a large pool, not enough to explain everything, but enough to worry everyone in the room. The radiologist looked at the physician. "This appears to be a small subarachnoid hemorrhage, a bleed around the brain." Nicholas stared at them. "A bleed?" The physician nodded. "We need to find out why it happened." The first assumption seemed obvious. A blood vessel had ruptured, somewhere inside her brain, possibly an aneurysm. The emergency department moved quickly. A neurosurgeon was paged. The intensive care unit was notified. Another scan was ordered, not to confirm the bleeding, but to find what caused it. Because healthy 24-year-olds don't usually develop bleeding around the brain without a reason, and the doctors were about to discover that this wasn't an ordinary brain hemorrhage. The neurosurgeon arrived just after 2 a.m. He reviewed the CT scan in silence. Then he looked at Ava. "Tell me exactly what you remember." She closed her eyes. "We were at home." "The headache started after that?" She nodded. "It wasn't all at once. It kept getting worse." The neurosurgeon turned back to the images. The amount of bleeding was real, but it was small. Too small. It didn't fully explain how quickly her symptoms had progressed. Something wasn't adding up. He ordered another test, a CT angiogram. If an aneurysm had burst, the contrast dye should reveal it. An hour later, the images were ready. The physician scrolled through every artery supplying Ava's brain, one by one. Nothing. No aneurysm, no malformed blood vessel, no obvious source of bleeding. He frowned. If this isn't an aneurysm, he didn't finish the sentence. The room fell quiet. The emergency physician looked puzzled. So where did the blood come from? No one answered. By sunrise, Ava's headache had become unbearable. She vomited again. This time, she couldn't keep her eyes open. The nurse called her name. "Ava?" A slow response. Too slow. The neurosurgeon made another decision. "I want an MRI." The emergency physician looked surprised. "The CT already shows the bleed." "I know, but I think we're looking at the wrong problem." An hour later, the MRI began. Layer by layer, it built a far more detailed picture of her brain. The radiologist studied the first sequence, then the second. He stopped, zoomed in, measured something twice. Then he picked up the phone. "You need to come down here." The neurosurgeon arrived minutes later. The radiologist pointed to a tiny area buried deep inside the scan. "Do you see it?" He nodded slowly. "I do." "It doesn't belong there." For the first time that night, they had a clue. Not an answer, just a clue. And it would completely change what they thought had happened in that apartment. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by real medical mysteries like this, share this video and subscribe to this channel. And if you value these videos, there's a free link in the description and pinned comment that helps support the channel. Every bit of click helps us continue researching and telling these stories, and it's completely free. Let's continue. The MRI ruled out a tumor. The CT angiogram ruled out an aneurysm. The neurosurgeon leaned back in his chair. If this isn't an aneurysm, he looked toward the neurologist. Then what are we looking at? The neurologist zoomed in on another series of images. Not the bleed, the arteries. Look here. The vessels didn't look blocked. They looked smaller, almost as if someone had tightened a series of tiny clamps around them, one after another, throughout multiple regions of Ava's brain. He sat back. I think she has reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome. No one in the room spoke. The emergency physician frowned. I've only seen one case. The neurologist nodded. Most doctors never do. He walked over to Ava's bedside. What I'm about to explain is why tonight stopped being an emergency room case and became a neurological one. Here is what happened inside Ava's brain. For reasons doctors still do not completely understand, the arteries supplying blood to the brain can suddenly go into spasm. Not a blockage, not a clot, not a burst vessel, a spasm. The muscles built into the walls of those arteries contract without warning. The opening inside each vessel becomes narrower. Less blood reaches parts of the brain. At the same time, blood pressure can surge. The stressed blood vessels become unstable. Sometimes they recover on their own. Sometimes they leak. Sometimes they rupture. That is called reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome, or RCVS. It is uncommon, it is unpredictable, and it often begins with a single symptom doctors call a thunderclap headache. Not because it builds slowly, because it strikes all at once. Patients describe it as the worst headache of their lives, like being hit in the head without warning. Many collapse before they even know what happened. Others develop seizures. Some suffer strokes. Some bleed around the brain. The neurologist looked back at Nicholas. What brought you to the hospital was not what put Ava's life in danger. The room fell silent. The pelvic muscle spasm and the brain artery spasm happened almost at the same time. They were two separate medical emergencies. The first one was impossible to ignore. He glanced toward Ava. The second one was almost missed because everyone, including us, was focused on the first. For the first time that night, everything made sense. The embarrassing emergency had brought them to the hospital. The neurological emergency had nearly gone home unnoticed. The diagnosis finally had a name: reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome. For Nicholas, that sounded like good news. If you know what it is, he looked at the neurologist, then you can fix it, right? The neurologist didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up Ava's latest brain scan. The bleeding we found is small. He pointed to the bright area on the screen. But that's not what worries me most. He switched to another image. The arteries in her brain are still narrowing. Think of them like highways. When they're open, blood flows normally. When they suddenly tighten, parts of the brain begin receiving less oxygen. Nicholas swallowed. So open them. I wish it were that simple. The neurologist explained that there was no surgery to reverse the spasms, no clot to remove, no aneurysm to clip, no single procedure that could make the arteries relax on command. Instead, they had to support the brain while waiting for the blood vessels to recover. That was the dangerous part. Every hour mattered. If the arteries narrowed further, she could suffer a stroke. If another vessel leaked, the bleeding could worsen. If swelling developed, pressure inside her skull could begin to rise. The nurse entered with Ava's latest vital signs. Her blood pressure had climbed again. The neurologist looked at the monitor. We need to bring it down. A resident reached for an antihypertensive medication. The neurologist stopped him. Slowly. The resident looked confused. If we lower it too fast, the neurologist pointed to the scans. The narrowed arteries may not deliver enough blood to her brain. He looked around the room. If we leave it too high, we increase the risk of another hemorrhage. The room grew quiet. They weren't choosing between a good option and a bad one. They were choosing between two risks. Lower the pressure too aggressively, and they could trigger a stroke. Leave it too high, and another blood vessel might bleed. There was no perfect answer, only careful balance. Ava was transferred to the neurological intensive care unit. Every hour, nurses checked her pupils. Every hour, they tested her strength. Every hour, they asked the same questions. What is your name? Do you know where you are? What day is it? Because in RCVs, a patient can look stable one moment and deteriorate the next. The first 24 hours would tell the doctors whether the narrowing in Ava's brain was beginning to reverse, or whether the worst was still ahead. The first night passed without another hemorrhage. No seizures, no loss of consciousness. The monitors remained quiet. For the first time since the ambulance ride, Nicholas thought they might be out of danger. He was wrong. RCVS doesn't always cause its worst damage immediately. Sometimes the arteries continue tightening for days before they begin to recover. That was what worried the neurologist. Every few hours, Ava rated her headache. 9. 4 hours later, 8. Then, without warning, 10. The pain came in waves. Not because the bleeding was getting larger, because the arteries in her brain were still going into spasm. The nurses kept the room dark. Even the glow from the hallway made her squeeze her eyes shut. She barely touched the meals they brought her. Water was all she wanted. Nicholas stayed. He wasn't family. He wasn't her boyfriend. He wasn't even listed as her emergency contact. But he was the only person who had been there from the beginning. He sat in the same chair every day. Sometimes they talked. Most of the time they didn't. On the second morning, Ava finally broke the silence. I'm sorry. Nicholas looked up. For what? For dragging you into this. He shook his head. You didn't. She managed a faint smile. I don't think anyone's ever had a worse first ambulance ride. He laughed. Just once. It didn't last. A few hours later, the neurologist returned with the results of another scan. He placed the images beside the first MRI. The bleeding hasn't increased. Nicholas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the neurologist pointed to several arteries. The narrowing is still there. Not worse, not better, just there. That was the frustrating part about RCVs. There wasn't a medicine that could make the arteries instantly return to normal. The doctors could only control the conditions around them, prevent complications, watch, wait, hope. By the third day, something finally changed. Ava opened her eyes before the nurse called her name. The headache? The nurse asked. Ava thought for a moment. 5. It was the first time the number had gone down. The neurologist smiled, not because she was cured, because for the first time, her brain was giving them reason to believe it was beginning to recover. But before anyone talked about going home, there was one more question that needed answering. Why had this happened to an otherwise healthy 24-year-old in the first place? 5 days after arriving at the hospital, Ava walked out, slowly, carefully, but on her own. The headache that had once felt unbearable had faded into a dull ache. Her follow-up MRI showed no new bleeding. The arteries that had narrowed so suddenly were beginning to relax, just as mysteriously as they had tightened. That was the reversible, part of reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome. For most patients, the spasms gradually disappear over weeks, but reversible doesn't always mean without consequences. Some patients are left with permanent strokes. Others lose part of their vision. Some never recover their memory completely. Ava had been fortunate, very fortunate. But before Ava left the hospital, she asked the neurologist one question. Why me? She was 24. She exercised. She didn't smoke. She didn't have high blood pressure. No history of stroke. No aneurysm. No neurological disease. So what caused this? The neurologist pulled up a chair. I wish I could give you a simple answer. The truth is, we still don't fully understand why reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome happens. Researchers believe the condition begins when the brain temporarily loses control of the muscles surrounding its arteries. Instead of smoothly widening and narrowing to control blood flow, the vessels suddenly clamp down. Some patients develop RCVs after childbirth, others after taking certain antidepressants. some after using stimulant drugs, others after taking decongestants or migraine medications, and some after intense physical exertion, including sexual activity. Not because sex is dangerous, but because orgasm can produce a sudden surge of adrenaline and blood pressure. For reasons medicine still doesn't completely understand, that surge can trigger the arteries to go into spasm in susceptible people. Most people experience that surge thousands of times without a problem. A tiny number don't. Ava happened to be one of them. She looked down at her hands. So this could have happened anyway? The neurologist nodded. It wasn't something you did wrong. It was an extremely rare reaction to something millions of people experience safely every day. He paused. But there is one thing that almost made it much worse. He looked at Nicholas. If the two of you had been too embarrassed to call for help, your headache might have been dismissed as stress. The bleeding could have continued. The stroke might not have been discovered until it was too late. The room became quiet. For the first time since that night, both of them realized something. The most embarrassing moment of their lives may also have been the reason Ava survived. Nicholas drove her home. Neither of them said much during the drive. The silence wasn't awkward. It was different. The kind that follows a week neither of them ever expected to live through. When they reached her apartment, Nicholas carried her overnight bag inside. He looked toward the bedroom door. Neither of them moved. Finally, Ava broke the silence. I don't think I'm ever going to look at that room the same way again. Nicholas managed a smile. Me neither. For weeks afterward, they both replayed that night in their minds. Not the embarrassment, the headache. The moment she'd quietly said, "My head hurts," neither of them had realized that those 3 words mattered far more than everything that had happened before them. Finally, they never became a couple. The arrangement that had once seemed so simple quietly came to an end. Not because of what happened in the apartment, but because every time they looked at each other, they remembered the night an embarrassing emergency turned into a neurological one, and how close they had come to missing the difference entirely. They were intimate. 30 minutes later, they couldn't separate. At first, they thought that was the emergency. It wasn't. The emergency had already begun, inside Ava's brain. While both of them were focused on one involuntary muscle spasm, another involuntary spasm was happening in the arteries supplying blood to her brain. One left them embarrassed, the other nearly left her with a permanent stroke. That was the only difference. Here is what I need you to remember. Reversible cerebral vasoconstriction syndrome is rare. Most people will never experience it. Millions of people have sex every day without developing a thunderclap headache. But if during or immediately after sexual activity, someone experiences the worst headache of their life, especially if it's accompanied by vomiting, confusion, weakness, trouble speaking, vision changes, or loss of consciousness, don't assume it's stress. Don't assume it's dehydration. Don't assume it will pass. Seek emergency medical care immediately. Because doctors cannot diagnose what they are never told, and they cannot treat what they are never given the chance to see. Nicholas still thinks about that night. Not because of the embarrassment, because of one sentence. My head hurts. 3 simple words. 3 words that almost disappeared beneath everything else that was happening. Ava thinks about them too. She recovered. Her follow-up scans returned to normal. The headache stopped. She went back to work, back to her friends, back to living the life she had before that Thursday night. But every year, when the date comes around, she remembers how close she came to becoming another unexplained stroke in a healthy young adult. 2 healthy adults walked into an emergency room because they couldn't separate. Only one of them was actually experiencing a neurological emergency. That was the only difference. That was the entire difference. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. These stories take a lot of research to put together. If you'd like to support the channel, you'll find a free link in the description and pinned comment. Checking it out helps support future videos, and every click allows us to keep bringing these cases to the channel. Also, it's completely free. If you learned something from this case, like, share, and subscribe for more real medical stories. And if you chose not to subscribe, leave a comment and tell me what would make these videos better. I read far more comments than you might think. This is Hidden Pathogens. I'll see you in the next video. Good night.
This is Hidden Pathogens.